Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. It's almost time to get your shots. Updated vaccines for COVID-19 and the flu are right around the corner. And for some, a new vaccine to protect against RSV, a virus particularly dangerous to babies and older adults. Today, Johns Hopkins virologist Andy Pekosz returns to the podcast to talk with Stephanie Desmon about when each vaccine will be available and how getting vaccinated early could possibly head off the severe tripledemic conditions that we saw last winter. Let's listen. Andy Pekosz, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, wonderful to be here, Stephanie.
So today we're going to talk about your favorite vaccines, vaccines for respiratory diseases. And last year we had what people were calling the tripledemic, right? The high rates of COVID, flu, and RSV. And the immunizations for the future, for this coming fall, are going to really be wrapped around those three diseases. And so I would like to start with COVID. So there's going to be a new COVID shot, but what do we know about it?
Yeah, so the FDA voted to update the COVID vaccine to represent one of the variants that are collectively called XBB. And they showed a lot of data showing that while there's a couple of different XBBs, they all sort of look the same and antibodies to one recognize the other. So the vaccine manufacturers will now make an XBB-based vaccine for the fall. It will no longer be what we used to call the bivalent booster, which had two viruses in it. This one will only have one. And that is what people will have available in the fall in order to get immunized. The thing that we're not yet clear about is, the FDA just voted to change the vaccine. They didn't make any recommendations on how that vaccine should be used. They're sort of leaving that up to the CDC to come up with some firm guidance, but most likely it will be what we've heard before. It'll be recommended that people, particularly over the age of 60, who are further than 4 to 6 months away from their last COVID booster, it'll be recommended that they get this vaccine. It'll be available for other people. It's probably not going to be recommended for younger age groups. But as a virologist, as I look at the data, if you haven't had a vaccine in 6 months or a year, this is a good variant to take because it's very different from the variants that you've been immunized with before. And again, if you've had 6 to 12 months before your last exposure to a COVID vaccine or to COVID itself, this is a good time to get a booster to really strengthen your immunity because, again, population immunity helps keep case numbers down.
If you've never been vaccinated, do we have any idea what the recommendation will be? I guess they're not making the other ones anymore, right? They'll just be recommending you start now.
Yeah. It'll be the standard 2 doses, and then you'll have to get a third dose at some point later on to be considered fully vaccinated. You'll be starting, though, with the XBB vaccine that'll be available this fall. The vaccine schedule is a little bit different for children because I guess that's always going to be the population now that's coming through that will be, the first to get immunized. So the vaccine schedule is a little bit different for those 6 months and older, 2 years and older, based on the vaccine that you used. But your pediatrician will have all of those specific informations on how to get the youngest children into the COVID-19 vaccination pool.
So while our surveillance of current cases is not as good as it was, I understand scientists are paying attention to what's circulating. So we do know that this is what's circulating.
Absolutely. We're fortunate that case numbers have really gone down over this past 6 months. We still have circulation of COVID-19. But case numbers have gone down. The corresponding deaths and hospitalizations have gone down. But we're still using those pool of COVID cases to sequence and get some sense of what's happening here in the United States. And there's probably about a handful of countries that are doing a really good job of sequencing as well. So we are monitoring things. We're monitoring case numbers. So we have some sense of what's going on, but it certainly isn't anywhere as in depth or as rapid as it was, let's say, a year ago.
So September, we expect that the COVID vaccine and recommendations will be available. So then the next question, of course, is flu. So you and I always talk about this time of the year about getting a flu shot. So when will these be available and what are we going to see?
The vaccine should be rolling out end of August. I'm sure you'll be seeing signs on pharmacies that say flu shots available around that time. The vaccine formulation was decided about 6 months ago, and the recommendations will be the same as they usually are. Everybody over the age of 6 months is recommended to get a flu vaccine. If you're younger, it's a 2-shot schedule. If you're an adult over the age of 12, it's a 1 shot and you're done kind of thing. We're just starting to see some data coming from the Southern Hemisphere, which is right now in the middle of its winter. And there seems to be a good amount of influenza activity. All the different components of the vaccine are active in different countries. So, in the next month or so, we'll get some sense of how similar those viruses are to our vaccine, which will give us at least a sneak peek in terms of what we might expect for this coming flu season.
So you don't want to get your flu vaccine too early, but last year's flu season started pretty early. So what do we make of that?
Exactly. In some ways, it's kind of like timing the stock market. You probably don't want to do too much thinking about that because you're more likely then to get it wrong. But September is a great time to get the flu vaccine. That September-October window is early enough so that if flu starts to emerge like it did last year at the end of October and into November, you still have a couple of weeks after your vaccine to get your immunity up. And if flu does emerge in December, January, February, your vaccine immunity will still be helping you if you get it in that September-October window.
And we do know that the strains seem to be lining up with illness. Is that correct?
Yes, all of the strains that are in the Northern Hemisphere vaccine are circulating in the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, every year it's a great idea to get the flu vaccine, but this year in particular, it really does look like everything is circulating in the Southern Hemisphere. So more than likely, 1 or 2 of those strains will make it up to the Northern Hemisphere and start circulating here. And so it's, again, great to get the vaccine because we know the vaccine helps against severe disease and it helps across all age groups.
All right. So last but not least is RSV. Could you remind people what that is?
Yeah, RSV is respiratory syncytial virus. It's a common pathogen that's seen in very young children, but it also causes a lot of severe disease in the elderly, individuals over the age of 60. Last year, we had a really large RSV outbreak that covered, again, the young and the very old. We didn't have any kind of real treatments or vaccines against RSV last year. But the big news is that this year we actually do have a vaccine for that over the age of 60 population that's been FDA approved. The clinical trials look great in terms of its efficacy, and that'll be rolling out in this fall.
What about for kids?
For kids, for the particularly young population, there'll be a new antibody treatment that's specific for RSV. That'll be available for lots of the newborn kids, particularly ones in high-risk groups. And it's an improved antibody treatment over the ones that were available in previous years. It will have a much longer half-life, and you'll only need 1 injection to protect children for about 6 months or so. So at both ends of the spectrum this year, we'll have much better tools to try to fight off RSV than we have in the past.
I guess this is just a lucky coincidence of timing.
Absolutely. Some of this was under development even before the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, one of the ironic things about the COVID-19 pandemic is the vaccines for COVID-19 were really based on the RSV vaccines, which were really showing a lot of promise in 2019 in clinical trials. The RSV got put on the back burner when COVID happened, and the COVID vaccines were developed using that same technology. And now a few years later, we're coming back to finally approve the RSV vaccine that in many ways formed the basis for those successful COVID-19 vaccines.
Now, RSV doesn't mutate as much as the others, I don't believe. So is this like a one-time shot?
We're hopeful if that's the case. What we haven't really seen, though, is the effect of vaccine-induced immunity on how the virus will evolve. So labs like BioLaboratory, for instance, are gearing up to do a little bit of RSV work this coming fall because we want to start to see, are the RSV infections happening in vaccinated people or unvaccinated people? And is the virus changing if it does happen to infect a vaccinated person? But the RSV vaccines, unlike flu, RSV doesn't change nearly as much as flu. It certainly doesn't change anywhere close to as much as we've seen COVID-19 change. So there probably is not going to be a big need to update the RSV vaccine on a regular basis. And again, that's not so challenging to manufacturers these days, but when it comes to things like cost and messaging, it's always nice to always have the same vaccine and be able to administer that over a couple of years. And so I think that'll be a nice message that'll be sent to the people who are eligible to take that vaccine.
So flu vaccine has always been a difficult sell. Not a lot of people get vaccinated against the flu. But what are the numbers, basically?
We're happy when we hit 50% of the population. Oftentimes it doesn't.
Yeah. And I know that COVID, there's been some reluctance as well to get those vaccines, and especially maybe to get repeated vaccines. And now we have this new one. Talk to me about sort of concerns that people might tune out.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where, a lot of people have now really started to focus in on this communication issue. I, as a scientist, can point to the data that shows these vaccines are working, that these vaccines are safe, that these vaccines, if used at a certain level, will make an incredibly large impact in terms of individuals' health, not stressing our healthcare system, and those kind of things. What I think we've learned, particularly in the last couple of years of the COVID-19 pandemic, that it's not enough just to have the data. You have to find ways to get that information to people in ways that they understand, that they trust, that they feel comfortable with. Because just putting out a marker on a CDC website saying, get your vaccine because it works, that does not communicate effectively to a large swath of the population. And we've also got to use our social media in positive ways to get these messages across, because these vaccines will make a really big difference this year, again, particularly that RSV vaccine. And we have to find ways to get those populations to understand that and to hear that message clearly and effectively.
Now, a lot of vaccines, obviously, there's a whole mandated schedule for children and adolescents. There's not so much for adults. So it's seen as optional and many people opt out. Is there any push to make these things not so optional?
Yeah, that's always a tricky slope to be on. It's something that I think as public health investigators, we see the benefit of having that kind of mandated large-scale vaccination. But certainly, whenever you say that word mandate, you also then get people to become a little bit more hesitant about things because they're wondering about that. So it's about finding that sweet spot of how we want to really make sure that the benefits are there without making people feel like they're being forced to do something that they're not completely clear about. I think that falls into the communication thing. And more, we're realizing that communication platforms, yours is one of them, but there's lots of other ways that we can get this information out to people that they understand and are more comfortable hearing.
Well, Andy Pekosz, as always, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmon. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.